The Cold Road and the Child. Jack Callahan had spent the last 20 years driving across the country, his life dictated by the hum of an 18-wheeler's engine and the endless highways stretching before him. He was a man who found comfort in the solitude of the road, with nothing but the rhythmic rumble of tires on asphalt and the occasional chatter of the CB radio to keep him company. But on this night, something was different. The air outside was brutally cold, the kind of bitter January chill that bit through even the thickest jackets. The heater in his truck was working overtime, pushing out warm air that barely seemed to make a difference. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his breath fogging slightly as he exhaled. It was late, 2:47 a.m., according to the glowing red numbers on his dashboard. He still had about 4 hours left before his next stop, a small truck stop diner near Columbus. It was a night like any other, until it wasn't. As he passed mile marker 182, something caught his eye on the dark shoulder of the road. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a dog that had strayed too close to the highway. But as he got closer, his heart stopped. A child. A small figure, hunched and shivering in the freezing cold. Jack's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. What in God's name was a kid doing out here in the dead of night? There were no houses nearby, no cars pulled over, just miles and miles of open, desolate road. He hit the hazard lights and slowly pulled his rig to the side, his heart pounding. "Murphy, you copy?" came a familiar voice over the CB radio. It was Tommy, another trucker who often ran this route. Jack reached for the receiver. "Yeah, I copy, Tommy. I've got a situation here. Kid on the side of the road at mile marker 182. I'm stopping to check it out." Silence on the other end. Then, Tommy's voice came back, laced with concern. "A kid, you sure?" Jack took a deep breath. "Positive. Stand by." He unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his thick jacket from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the cold. The moment he did, the icy wind hit him like a slap. It was brutal. He turned his flashlight toward the small figure. A girl, no older than 7 or 8. She stood there, shivering violently, her arms wrapped around her tiny body. She wore nothing but a thin hoodie, tattered leggings and socks. No shoes. Her dark hair was matted, and her lips were blue from the cold. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something worse. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called, keeping his voice gentle. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The girl flinched, taking a step back. Her eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the road, like she was expecting something or someone. Jack raised both hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you. Just want to help." She didn't answer. Jack's instincts, honed from years of reading people, told him she was terrified, not just of him, but of something far worse. His breath puffed in the cold air as he knelt down, trying to make himself less intimidating. "My name's Jack. I drive trucks for a living. I've got a warm cab just over there. You don't have to talk, but at least let me get you warm." Still, no response. Jack exhaled and slowly shrugged off his thick jacket, placing it on the ground between them. "Here," he said softly. "You don't have to come with me. Just take this. You're freezing." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, like a scared animal, she darted forward, snatched the jacket, and wrapped it around herself. Jack felt his heart clench. That was all the proof he needed. Something was very, very wrong. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her lips parting like she was debating whether to speak. Then, in the softest whisper, she said, "Emmy." Jack swallowed. "Nice to meet you, Emmy. Can I ask how you got here?" She shook her head violently, stepping back again. Terror flooded her expression. Jack knew that kind of fear, the kind that came from someone who had been hurt, badly. He decided to change tactics. "All right, Emmy, I won't ask any more questions right now. but it's way too cold for you to be out here. I've got some hot chocolate in the truck. Would you like some?" The girl hesitated. Jack saw the battle in her eyes, fear warring with desperation. She was cold, hungry, but she didn't trust him. That told him everything he needed to know. She had run from something, and whatever it was, she was more afraid of going back than freezing to death. Jack took a deep breath. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Tell you what," he said, standing up slowly. "I'll leave the truck door open. You can come in if you want, warm up, get some food. If you don't feel safe, you can leave anytime." Emmy stared at him, her small body trembling. Then, finally, she took a step forward. Jack didn't move, didn't rush her. He just waited as she shuffled toward the truck, her bare feet red and raw from the freezing pavement. When she reached the door, she hesitated again. Jack gestured to the passenger seat. "Go ahead. I'll stay right here." Emmy climbed in, curling into the seat, still clutching his jacket like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Jack took one last look at the dark road, searching for whoever she might be running from, before stepping up into the cab and shutting the door. The truck was warm, the heater blasting, but Emmy was still shaking. Jack reached into his thermos holder and pulled out a cup of hot chocolate. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "It's warm. Just sip it slow." She took it, her small fingers wrapped tightly around the cup, and lifted it to her lips. Jack let out a quiet breath. A small victory. As the truck idled on the shoulder of the road, Jack reached for his radio. "Murphy to Tommy," he said, his voice low. "The kid's in the cab. She's scared out of her mind, and I don't think she's just lost. Something's not right." "Copy that," Tommy responded. "Want me to call someone?" Jack looked at Emmy. She was watching him, her big eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else. Hope. Jack made a decision. "Not yet," he said into the radio. "I'll get her to safety first. Then we'll figure out what the hell happened to this kid." He put the truck into gear, merging back onto the cold, empty highway. And deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Shadows of the past. The hum of the truck's engine filled the cabin, a steady, rhythmic sound that had always comforted Jack Callahan on long, lonely nights. But tonight, the warmth of the heater, the familiar scent of black coffee, and the glow of the dashboard lights did little to ease his mind. There was a child in his passenger seat, a freezing, terrified little girl who had no business being out on a desolate highway in the middle of the night. Jack stole a glance at Emmy. She was still curled up in his oversized jacket, clutching the thermos of hot chocolate like a lifeline. Her bare feet were tucked beneath her, red and raw from the cold pavement she'd been walking on. The way she flinched at every bump in the road made Jack's stomach twist. This kid had been through something bad. He kept his voice low, gentle. "How's the hot chocolate?" Emmy nodded slightly but said nothing. Her small hands trembled as she brought the thermos to her lips. Not from the cold this time. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel. He'd seen a lot in his years on the road. Wrecks, lost souls, and people who'd made all the wrong choices. But this? A child alone, running from something. This was new, and it wasn't sitting right. "Murphy, you still there?" Tommy's voice crackled through the CB radio. Jack grabbed the receiver. "Yeah, kid's in the cab. She's shaken up but drinking some hot chocolate." "You sure she ain't lost?" Tommy asked. Jack glanced at Emmy again. She was listening, her grip tightening around the thermos, scared to hear what Jack might say. "No," Jack answered after a pause. "I don't think she's lost. I think she ran." There was silence on the radio before Tommy sighed. "Damn. What do you need, brother?" Jack thought for a moment. "I'm heading toward that truck stop near Columbus. I'll figure out my next move there." "You want me to call the cops?" Jack's eyes flicked back to Emmy. Her body had gone rigid, her knuckles white, as she gripped the thermos. She was afraid of the cops. That was another warning bell. He made his decision. "Not yet. I need more information. All right, Murph. But be careful, man. Jack placed the receiver back and let out a slow breath. He had 1 hour until the truck stopped. 1 hour to figure out what the hell was going on. The first words. Jack adjusted the truck's speed, keeping it smooth. He didn't want to startle her. You don't talk much, do ya? He asked, keeping his tone light. Emmy shook her head. That's all right. I've met plenty of folks who don't like to talk. He tapped his fingers on the wheel. I used to know a guy. Big Joe. Drove for 30 years. Hardly said a word. People called him a grump. But he was just quiet. Emmy stared ahead, listening. Jack smiled. One time, he got so sick of us asking him stuff, he wrote everything down on a notepad and just showed it to people instead. A small, almost imperceptible twitch of her lips. Not quite a smile, but close. Jack felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just scared. She was listening, thinking, maybe even starting to feel safe. He decided to push just a little. So, Emmy, you got folks around here. She stiffened, her hands clenched into tiny fists. Jack immediately backed off. Hey, it's okay. You don't have to answer. Just trying to help. Silence. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, I can't go back. Jack's jaw tightened. That was it. That was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't a case of a lost kid. She was running. He kept his voice steady. All right. You don't have to. Another silence. Then, barely above the hum of the engine. Promise. Jack felt something break in his chest. He swallowed the lump in his throat. With everything I've got, sweetheart. She didn't say anything else, but Jack swore he saw her shoulders ease. Just a little. She believed him. At least for now. The truck stop decision. The neon lights of the Columbus truck stop came into view an hour later, flickering in the cold night. Jack pulled his rig into a parking spot near the diner, shutting off the engine. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few long-haul truckers grabbing a late meal. Emmy looked at the glowing diner open 24 hours sign. Jack unbuckled his seatbelt. You hungry? She hesitated. Grilled cheese? Jack offered. Maybe some soup. Slowly, she nodded. All right then. He opened the door. Come on, kiddo. She hesitated again, looking down at her bare feet. Jack didn't even think twice. He grabbed an extra pair of socks from his small duffel bag and offered them to her. Here, they're clean. She stared at them like they were some foreign object before finally, cautiously, taking them. She slid them over her small, frost-bitten feet. Jack reached out a hand. Come on, let's get you warm. This time, she took it. And for the first time that night, Jack Callahan let himself hope. Darlene knows everything. The moment they stepped into the diner, a voice boomed across the room. Well, I'll be damned. Jack Callahan, I was just saying it's been too long since your ugly face walked through these doors. Jack chuckled. Nice to see you too, darling. Darlene was the diner's owner, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a soft heart. She wore an old apron covered in coffee stains and had a voice that could scare a full-grown man into behaving. But when she saw Emmy, something in her face changed. She immediately stepped out from behind the counter, her sharp eyes softening. Jack saw the moment she put the pieces together. Who's this, honey? She asked gently. Jack exhaled. Her name's Emmy. Darlene crouched slightly, her voice warm and inviting. Well, Miss Emmy, welcome to my little slice of heaven. You like grilled cheese. Emmy hesitated, glancing up at Jack. He nodded. She's good, Dar. Darlene smiled. Then come on in, sweetheart. Let's get you something warm. She led them to a booth in the corner, away from the few other customers. Emmy climbed in, curling into the seat. Jack sat across from her. Darlene didn't ask too many questions. She just brought them hot soup, grilled cheese, and a warm blanket. But Jack knew her well enough to see the concern in her eyes. When Emmy was finally eating, her small hands gripping the sandwich like she hadn't eaten in days, Darling leaned over and whispered, "What happened, Jack?" Jack sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know yet, Dar," he admitted, "but I'm damn sure I'm gonna find out." Darling nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You do that," she said. "And in the meantime, I'll make sure no one comes looking." Jack glanced at Emmy. Her eyes were drooping, her tiny frame finally relaxing in the warmth. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked safe. Jack exhaled and leaned back in the booth. He knew one thing for sure. Whatever this kid had been through, it wasn't over yet, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone. The secret she carries. Jack Callahan had seen his fair share of hard truths in life. 20 years on the road taught him that people ran for a reason. Whether it was a man escaping his past, a woman searching for a fresh start, or a kid like Emmy, running from something too big to face alone. And Jack was starting to get the sinking feeling that whatever Emmy had left behind, it was still out there looking for her. The truck stop diner was warm, its scent of fresh coffee and grilled bacon filling the air. But Jack wasn't feeling comfortable. Not yet. Across the booth, Emmy was eating like she hadn't seen food in days. She barely looked up from her plate, her small hands clutching the grilled cheese as she devoured it in careful, measured bites, as if she was afraid it would disappear. Jack had seen that before. Hunger like that wasn't just about food. It was about survival. Darling slid into the booth next to Jack, her eyes flicking between him and Emmy. She had a way of reading people better than most cops. "This ain't just a lost kid, is it?" she murmured under her breath. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his beard. "No, Dar," she ran. Darlene's jaw tightened. "From what?" Jack glanced at Emmy. She was listening. Even though her eyes stayed on her food, her small shoulders had tensed. She was waiting for what Jack would say. So he kept it simple. "I don't know yet, but I need to find out." Darling nodded. "You gonna call the cops?" Jack hesitated. He should. Every part of him knew he should, but then he looked at Emmy. The way her hand shook as she reached for her cup. The way she flinched at every sound from the door. The way she held herself like a kid who had learned not to trust anyone. And then he heard her voice, that small, terrified whisper from earlier. "I can't go back." Jack set his coffee down. "Not yet." Darling didn't argue. Instead, she patted his arm and stood. "Well then, I'll make sure nobody bothers you while you figure it out." Jack nodded, grateful. He turned his attention back to Emmy, who was now watching him carefully. "You did good, kid," he said, gesturing to her empty plate. "That hit the spot." She nodded, slowly, hesitant, but for the first time, she didn't look scared of him. Jack leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "You're safe here, Emmy. No one's gonna take you back somewhere you don't want to be. But I need to know what's going on. Can you tell me?" Her fingers tightened around the cup of hot chocolate. For a long moment, Jack thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "My uncle." Jack stiffened. His stomach turned. He knew what was coming next. The story that made Jack sick. Emmy's voice was small, but the weight of her words hit Jack like a semi-truck at full speed. "My uncle took me in after my mom left." Jack kept his expression neutral, but inside, his gut twisted. "Left?" he asked, careful not to push too hard. Emmy nodded. She said she had to go away for work, but she never came back." Jack exhaled slowly. He had seen that before. People leaving kids behind, thinking they'd come back for them. Most never did. "And your dad?" Jack asked gently. Emmy shook her head. "Never met him." Jack nodded, absorbing her words. "So your uncle took care of you." Her small hands clenched into fists. "He said he would." That was all Jack needed to hear. He'd heard enough stories from his wife Linda, who worked at a shelter, to recognize the signs. The way Emmy spoke, the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at loud noises. This wasn't just a rough home. This was worse. Much worse. Jack kept his voice steady. "Did he hurt you, Emmy?" Her breath hitched. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Jack's hands curled into fists under the table. She ran barefoot in the freezing cold to get away. That told him everything. And someone like that, someone who had scared a kid bad enough to risk freezing to death, they weren't just gonna let her go. Jack's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about helping a lost kid anymore. This was about keeping her safe. The danger that followed. Jack was about to speak when the bell over the diner's door jingled. A man stepped inside. Jack didn't know him, but something was off. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a cheap coat and a mean look in his eyes. He walked in like he was searching for something. Or someone. Jack didn't move, didn't react. But his instincts were screaming. He knew that look. Someone looking for a runaway. Emmy hadn't noticed yet. She was staring at the table, lost in her memories. Jack shifted slightly, keeping his body between her and the door. The man scanned the diner, eyes flicking across every booth. Jack kept his head down, but he was watching. He saw the moment the man's eyes landed on their booth. And the moment his expression darkened. This was bad. Jack reached under the table, resting his hand on his tire iron, one of the few weapons he carried on the road. The man took a step forward. Jack shifted his arm, casually placing it on the table, blocking Emmy from view. Darlene's voice rang out from behind the counter. "Can I help you, sir?" The man hesitated, his eyes narrowed at Jack. "Just looking for someone." Darlene raised an eyebrow. "We don't get many visitors this late. You expecting someone?" The man hesitated. For a moment, Jack thought he'd leave. But then, "She's about this tall," the man said, holding his hand up. "Black hair, wearing a hoodie. Name's Emmy." Jack felt Emmy freeze. The bastard knew her name. Darlene didn't even blink. She put a hand on her hip. "Haven't seen anyone like that. Just truckers passing through." The man's eyes darkened. Jack could tell he wasn't buying it. He had two options: play dumb, or get her out. Fast. Jack made his choice. He turned to Emmy and spoke low and firm. "Listen to me, sweetheart. I need you to trust me, okay?" Emmy nodded, her face pale. Jack slid out of the booth, keeping his back to the man. He leaned down, murmuring to Darlene. "Stall him." Darlene smirked. "Gladly." Jack placed a hand on Emmy's small shoulder. "Come on, kid," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. And just like that, he walked her toward the back exit. But as he pushed open the door, he heard the man's voice behind them. Jack's stomach dropped. They'd been made. And now, the real chase was about to begin. The chase in the dark. The second Jack heard the sharp bark of "hey" from inside the diner, his instincts kicked into overdrive. He didn't hesitate, didn't turn, didn't stop. He gripped Emmy's small, freezing hand and pushed through the back exit, stepping into the bitter cold of the truck stop's rear lot. It was dark, a few flickering streetlights barely illuminating the rows of parked rigs. But Jack knew how to disappear. His boots crunched on the frozen pavement as he moved fast, pulling Emmy with him. Behind them, the diner door slammed open. The man's angry voice rang out. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Too late. He was coming. Jack didn't run. Not yet. Running meant panic. Running meant making mistakes. Instead, he moved with purpose, weaving between the long-haul trucks parked in neat rows, their engines idling softly. Each step took them further into the shadows. But Emmy, she was scared. Her breath was coming too fast, her small feet struggling to keep up. Jack slowed for half a second, squeezing her hand. "Stick with me, kid. We'll get through this." She nodded, her eyes wide and terrified, but she didn't complain. She trusted him. Jack risked a glance back. The man was storming across the lot, scanning every row of trucks. Jack gritted his teeth. He had two options: get to his truck and drive. Problem was, that meant crossing open ground. They'd be seen. Hide. Problem there. Nowhere was truly safe. Jack's mind raced. Then, an idea. Over here. He tugged Emmy toward the nearest 18-wheeler, its trailer partially open. Lucky break. Most drivers kept their trailers locked up tight. But this one. Someone had been careless. Jack boosted Emmy up first. Climb in. Quietly. She scrambled inside, slipping through the narrow opening. Jack followed, pulling the metal latch down just enough to keep them hidden, but still leave a sliver of space to breathe. They huddled in the dark, surrounded by the smell of cardboard boxes and diesel. Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, footsteps. Right outside. The hunter and the hunted. Jack didn't move, didn't even breathe. Through the narrow gap, he saw boots crunching across the pavement. The man was close. Too close. His voice carried in the cold. "Hey, you seen a trucker with a little girl?" Another voice. Some other driver nearby. "Nah, man. Just trying to get some shut-eye." The man cursed under his breath. Then, silence. Jack held still, waiting. Waiting for the moment to move. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then, the sound of footsteps retreating. Emmy let out a tiny breath. Jack whispered, "Not yet." They waited a full minute before Jack peeked out. Clear. He slowly pushed the trailer door open. Stepped out first. Then, he lifted Emmy back down. She looked up at him, still shivering, but her voice was stronger now. "What now?" Jack scanned the lot. Then he saw it, a truck idling at the far end of the lot. Not his. But he recognized the CB radio antenna. Tommy. Jack's gut unclenched slightly. If anyone could help, it was Tommy. They just had to get there. The escape route. Jack led Emmy between the rows of rigs, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The cold bit into his skin, but he ignored it. Kept moving. One row over, he heard footsteps again. The man was still looking. Jack's jaw clenched. Persistent bastard. They'd reached Tommy's rig, a massive blue Kenworth with flame decals. Jack rapped on the door. Twice, then once. Their old signal. A second later, the window rolled down. A sleepy, confused Tommy peered out. "Jack? The hell you doing out here?" Jack didn't waste time. Didn't explain. "Need a ride." Now. Tommy saw Emmy. His expression shifted instantly. He didn't ask questions. He just unlocked the door. "Get in." Jack lifted Emmy up first, then climbed in behind her, shutting the door just as a shadow moved at the edge of the lot. The man. Jack's pulse hammered. "Drive, Tommy. Now." Tommy didn't hesitate. He threw the rig into gear, pulling out slow, like it was just another routine departure. But Jack didn't take his eyes off the mirror. The man stood at the edge of the truck stop, watching. Jack knew that look. The bastard wasn't giving up. And that meant one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What comes next? Tommy's rig rumbled down the highway, heading east, leaving the truck stopped behind. Inside the cab, it was warm, but the weight of what just happened still hung in the air. Tommy glanced over, his face serious. "Murph, what the hell is going on?" Jack sighed, running a hand down his face. He looked at Emmy. She was exhausted, her small hands still clutching his jacket like it was a lifeline. He turned back to Tommy. "It's bad, Tom. Real bad." Tommy's expression hardened. "Then tell me what we need to do." Jack didn't hesitate. "We need to get her somewhere safe." Tommy nodded. "I know a place." Jack felt a sliver of relief. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because whoever that man was, he wasn't done hunting. And Jack wasn't done protecting. Not by a long shot. Tommy's truck rumbled onto the highway, the deep growl of the engine masking the tension inside the cab. Jack kept his eyes on the side mirrors, watching the dimly lit truck stop shrink in the distance. The man hadn't followed. Not yet. But Jack knew better than to let his guard down. Emmy was curled up in the passenger seat, small and quiet, her face half buried in Jack's jacket. She wasn't asleep. Jack could tell by the way her fingers still twisted anxiously in the fabric, the way she kept sneaking glances at the road behind them. She was still scared. Jack couldn't blame her. Tommy glanced over, his usual easygoing grin replaced by a serious frown. "All right, Murph. Spill it. What the hell is going on?" Jack exhaled. Found her on the road, barefoot, freezing. She ran from something. From someone. Tommy's gaze flickered toward Emmy. "That guy back there. He the reason?" Jack nodded once. "Yeah." Tommy let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers on the wheel. "Damn. And I'm guessing the cops aren't an option." Jack shook his head. "Not yet. She's terrified of going back." Tommy grunted. "Figures." He rubbed his jaw. "All right. Where we headed?" Jack hesitated. Where could they go? They couldn't stay on the highway forever. And sooner or later, that bastard at the truck stop was going to realize they were gone. Jack's mind worked through the options fast. They needed somewhere safe. Somewhere to think. Somewhere Emmy wouldn't be found. Then an idea hit him. Ruthie's place. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Ruthie, you sure?" Jack nodded firmly. Ruthie was a former long-haul driver turned safe-house operator, one of the few people Jack trusted with his life. She ran a small trucker's motel off the beaten path, not exactly hidden, but damn near impossible to find if you didn't know where to look. Tommy mulled it over, then gave a sharp nod. "All right. It's 2 hours east. I'll take us there." Jack turned to Emmy. She was watching him, eyes wide and uncertain. "Emmy," Jack said gently. "That sound okay?" She didn't answer right away. Her small hands tightened in the sleeves of his jacket. "Will he find me?" Jack's jaw clenched. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "No, sweetheart," he promised. "Not while I'm here." Emmy nodded slowly, trusting him. Jack settled into the seat, but his mind didn't rest. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. A dangerous road ahead. They had been driving for about 40 minutes when Jack's gut twisted. Something felt off. He flicked his gaze toward the side mirror and froze. Headlights. Not just any headlights, a pair that had been tailing them for the last 10 miles. Jack's instincts screamed. "Tom," he said, voice low. Tommy glanced at the mirror. "You seein' what I'm seein'?" Jack nodded grimly. "Yeah." They were being followed. Tommy let out a slow curse. That him? Jack wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to take chances. "Lose him," Jack said. Tommy smirked. Gladly. The truck's engine roared. Jack felt the deep pull of acceleration as Tommy shifted gears, pushing the rig faster down the dark highway. Most big rigs couldn't outrun a car. But Tommy's truck wasn't like most rigs. He had custom mods, better handling, and a lead foot that had saved their asses more than once. The headlights behind them sped up. Jack's grip tightened. Then, the truck jerked as Tommy made an unexpected turn. An exit ramp. "Hold on," Tommy muttered. They veered off the highway, tires screeching slightly as they hit the curve. Jack stole a glance at the mirror. The headlights were gone. Tommy let out a breath. That shook him. Jack nodded, but his gut was still tight. Because whoever was following them, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ruthie's safe house. They pulled into Ruthie's trucker motel just past 4 a.m. It was a quiet, worn-down place, nestled between thick woods and an old gas station that hadn't been operational in years. Jack had been here before. More than once. Ruthie helped people who needed to disappear. She didn't ask questions, didn't expect answers. And right now, That's exactly what Jack needed. Tommy parked the rig near the back lot, where the shadows swallowed them whole. Jack turned to Emmy. She looked exhausted, pale, but she was still awake, still watching. "We're safe here, sweetheart," Jack told her. "You're gonna get some rest." She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she could believe that. Then, finally, she nodded. Jack opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. And that's when Ruthie appeared. She was tall and broad, with graying hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a cigarette dangling from her lips. Her sharp eyes scanned Jack, then flickered toward the small girl bundled in his jacket. She exhaled a plume of smoke. "Well, shit," she muttered. "You got yourself in some trouble, didn't you, Callahan?" Jack smirked tiredly. "Wouldn't be the first time." Ruthie sighed, taking another drag. "All right. You know the rules. This kid got someone after her." Jack's expression darkened. "Yeah." Ruthie flicked her cigarette into the dirt. "Then let's make damn sure they don't find her. The night isn't over." Inside, the motel was quiet and warm, the air filled with the scent of old coffee and worn leather. Ruthie led them to a back room, small, but safe. Jack turned to Emmy. "You get some sleep, all right. I'll be right here." Emmy hesitated. Then, for the first time, she reached out, grabbed his sleeve. "You won't leave." Jack felt something crack in his chest. "I promise." She nodded, curling up in the bed. And for the first time, she looked like she might actually rest. Jack let out a slow breath. Then, he turned to Ruthie. "We need to talk." Ruthie nodded, lighting another cigarette. "Yeah, we do." Jack's jaw tightened. "That guy, the one looking for her, he's not giving up." Ruthie exhaled smoke. "Then we make sure he doesn't find her." Jack glanced back at Emmy, the small, fragile kid who had run barefoot through the cold to escape something worse. He turned back to Ruthie, and his voice was low, cold. "If he comes looking, Ruth." Ruthie smirked. "Oh, honey, he won't like what he finds." Jack nodded. Because now, the hunt wasn't just on Emmy. Now, the hunt was on the bastard who wanted her back. And Jack Callahan. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The hunter becomes the hunted. Jack Callahan had spent 20 years on the road, but nothing had ever felt as important as protecting the scared little girl sleeping in the next room. He stood by the window of Ruthie's safe house motel, arms crossed, watching the empty road beyond the darkened parking lot. It was too quiet, too still. Tommy sat nearby, sipping a cup of Ruthie's terrible burnt coffee. "You gonna tell me what we're doing next, Murph?" Jack didn't answer right away. He was thinking, calculating. The bastard from the diner, Emmy's uncle, most likely, wasn't going to stop. That much was clear. Jack had seen men like him before, dangerous men. The kind who believed they owned people. The kind who thought they could take whatever they wanted and walk away clean. And right now, he wanted Emmy back. Not happening. Jack finally exhaled, turning to Ruthie. "You still got contacts at the station." Ruthie snorted. "You mean the one that doesn't ask too many questions?" She pulled a phone out of her back pocket. "Yeah. You want me to put some feelers out?" Jack nodded. "Find out if there's any police chatter about a missing kid matching Emmy's description." Ruthie gave a short nod and started dialing. Tommy leaned back, crossing his arms. And what if that bastard already reported her missing? Trying to twist things and say she ran away. Jack's jaw tightened. That was exactly what he was afraid of. Men like Emmy's uncle. They knew how to lie. How to make people believe they were the victim. If the cops got involved before Emmy had a chance to tell her side of the story. Jack's gut burned at the thought. Tommy must have seen the storm brewing in his expression because he sat forward, voice dropping. "We ain't gonna let that happen, Murph." Jack exhaled. "Yeah, I know." Now they just had to make sure of it. The first move. Ruthie ended her call 10 minutes later. She set the phone down and rubbed her forehead. Well, you're not gonna like it. Jack already knew. Emmy's uncle reported her missing, didn't he? Ruthie nodded. About 2 hours ago. Tommy cursed under his breath. Jack felt the weight of it settle in his chest. It was what he'd expected. Now, any cop who wasn't paying attention to the details would think Emmy was just some runaway. Jack had seen too many cases like this, where a kid had finally gotten away from someone hurting them, only to be dragged right back because the law was on the wrong side. Not this time. Jack turned to Ruthie. Who took the case? Local sheriff's department, Ruthie said. But here's the part that might work in our favor. They haven't gone statewide with it yet. Jack's mind worked fast. That meant they had a window. If they could get ahead of this, get Emmy somewhere safe, get her side of the story in front of the right people, they might be able to stop her from being sent right back into hell. He looked at Tommy. You still got that friend at Child Services? Tommy scratched his chin. Yeah. You thinkin' what I think you're thinkin'. Jack nodded. We need someone on our side before this thing gets any bigger. Tommy pulled out his phone. I'll make the call. Ruthie crossed her arms. And what are you gonna do? Jack cracked his knuckles. I'm gonna make sure that bastard doesn't get within 10 miles of her. Ruthie smirked. Now that's more like it. The calm before the storm. Jack went back to check on Emmy before making his next move. She was curled up under the thick blankets Ruthie had given her, but she wasn't asleep. Her wide dark eyes flickered toward him when he stepped inside. Jack crouched next to the bed. Hey, kiddo. Hey, she murmured. Jack hesitated, then asked, You warm enough? She nodded. Yeah, but something was off. Jack frowned. What's on your mind, sweetheart? Emmy shifted under the blankets. I heard you talking. Jack felt his stomach sink. I'm not going back, she said softly. But her voice wasn't just scared. It was angry. Jack saw it then, the steel in her eyes. She'd been running for so long, but she wasn't just afraid anymore. She was tired of being afraid. Jack nodded. No, Emmy, you're not. She swallowed hard. What if he finds me? Jack exhaled. He wouldn't lie to her. He's looking, but so are we, and you've got people on your side now. She bit her lip. You promise? Jack reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. She didn't. He squeezed her small hand, gentle but firm. I promise. Jack's plan. Jack stepped outside, where Ruthie and Tommy were waiting. Tommy hung up his phone. All right, my guy at Child Services is in. He says if we can get Emmy to him first, he'll make sure the right people hear her story. He knows a trauma specialist who can vouch for her. Jack nodded. Good. Ruthie tossed Jack a set of keys. Jack caught them, raising an eyebrow. What's this? Keys to an old Chevy I keep in the back. Ruthie said, Figured your truck is too recognizable. If anyone's watching the roads, they'll be looking for a rig, not a beat-up pickup. Jack grinned. You always did have a backup plan. Ruthie smirked. You're damn right. Jack turned to Tommy. You'll take the truck, yeah? Lead him the wrong way. Tommy clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. Hell yeah. I've always wanted to be part of a high-speed getaway. Jack chuckled. Let's not get too dramatic. Tommy grinned. Too late. Jack turned serious. You be careful, all right? Tommy's grin faded. Always. Ruthie lit another cigarette. So what's your play, Callahan? Jack took a deep breath. Step 1. Get Emmy out of here. Step 2. Get her to the Child Services contact before the Sheriff's Department got involved. Step 3. Make sure her uncle never laid eyes on her again. Jack's voice was steady when he answered. We get her somewhere safe. He turned to look at the horizon. And if that bastard tried to follow? Jack was going to make damn sure he regretted it. The road to justice. Jack Callahan had driven through storms, dodged reckless drivers, and outrun the kind of trouble that stuck to men like a second skin. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just hauling freight. He was carrying a little girl's future, and he wasn't about to let her down. The switch up. The night air was thick with tension as Jack climbed into the rusty old Chevy pickup Ruthie had handed over. The engine rumbled to life, loud but reliable. In the passenger seat, Emmy sat bundled in a blanket, her eyes wide and alert despite the exhaustion pulling at her small frame. "You ready, kid?" Jack asked, keeping his voice steady. Emmy nodded. "Yeah." Jack glanced over at Tommy, who was already settling into Jack's rig, the big black Freightliner that had been home for so many years. "You sure about this, Tommy?" Jack asked. Tommy shot him a grin. "Hell yeah. I'll lead 'em right where they don't want to be. Give you time to get the kid out of here." Jack trusted Tommy with his life, but sending his friend straight into the fire, that didn't sit easy. "You get in trouble, you call me," Jack said firmly. Tommy smirked. "Murph, I've been dodging trouble since before you knew how to drive a rig. I'll be fine." Jack didn't argue. He just reached out and clasped Tommy's shoulder. "See you on the other side." Tommy nodded, then turned the key. The Freightliner roared to life, its deep rumble vibrating through the ground. As Tommy pulled out onto the road, Jack watched the taillights disappear into the distance. Then, with a slow breath, he put the Chevy in gear and headed in the opposite direction. Time to get Emmy to safety. The wrong kind of attention. For the first 20 miles, the road was quiet. Jack kept his speed steady, watching the rearview mirror for any signs of trouble. Emmy sat silent beside him, tucked into the warmth of Ruthie's old coat. She didn't speak much, but Jack could tell she was thinking, processing. He let her have that space. The highway stretched ahead, dark, empty, endless. Then, about 30 miles out, Jack spotted something in the mirror. Headlights. His stomach tightened. They weren't coming fast. Just steady. Like they weren't in a rush. Like they already knew where he was going. Jack's fingers tightened on the wheel. Emmy noticed the shift in his posture. "What is it?" she asked softly. Jack kept his voice calm, controlled. "Could just be another driver," he said. "But I don't like how they're sitting back." Emmy went quiet. Jack's mind raced. If they had been followed from Ruthie's, then Emmy's uncle wasn't just looking. He was tracking. And that meant Jack's jaw clenched. "Kid," he said slowly, "your uncle, he ever put something on you? Like a tracking device?" Emmy blinked. "What?" Jack kept his eyes on the mirror. "A bracelet. A necklace. Anything you always had to wear." Her face paled. "My backpack," she whispered. He always made me bring it." Jack swore under his breath. That was it. He reached into the back seat, grabbed the worn-out little pink backpack Emmy had been carrying since he found her. "Can I check something?" he asked. She nodded. Jack pulled onto a side road, stopping beneath the shadow of a dense tree line. The headlights in the distance kept going. Jack didn't breathe until they were out of sight. Then he flipped on the cabin light and unzipped the backpack. Inside, just kid stuff. A stuffed bear, a notebook, some old snacks, and at the bottom, Jack's fingers brushed against something cold and hard. He pulled it out, a small silver device. It took all of Jack's self-control not to snap the damn thing in half. Instead, he looked at Emmy. "He was tracking you." Her breath hitched. "But why?" Jack clenched his jaw. "Because he didn't want to lose you. Because you were something he thought he could control." But he didn't say that. Instead, he pulled out his knife, flipped it open, and sliced the tracker clean in two. He tossed the broken pieces into the woods. Then he turned back to Emmy, his voice low but certain. "He's not tracking you anymore." She nodded, a hint of relief flickering across her face. But Jack knew they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had to reach Tommy's contact at Child Services before the wrong people got involved. And something told him they weren't done running. Not yet. The last mile. Jack put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway, heading toward the last safe stop before sunrise. They had 1 more hour to go. The roads were mostly empty, just a few scattered rigs and long-haul drivers pushing through the night. Jack felt the tension ease just a little. But then, in the distance on the side of the road, a car was parked. Jack's gut went cold. A dark sedan, tinted windows, no lights on. He couldn't see inside. But he didn't have to. He knew. That's him, Emmy whispered. Jack's pulse pounded. He kept his speed steady, didn't slow, didn't speed up, just kept driving. As they passed, Jack glanced at the sedan, and in the driver's seat, a man, sitting still, watching, waiting. Jack knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The final stand. Jack had 2 choices. Keep driving, hope to reach the drop point before Emmy's uncle made a move. End this now. Jack glanced at Emmy. She was tired, scared, but she was still fighting. And Jack had been on the road too long to let some piece of garbage think he could take a kid and walk away clean. So Jack made his decision. He took the next exit, drove off the highway, and waited. Because if Emmy's uncle wanted to come for her, Jack Callahan was done running. Now, it was time for the bastard to learn what happens when you try to take something that doesn't belong to you. Jack cracked his knuckles. Then he turned to Emmy. You trust me, kid? She nodded. Jack exhaled. Good, because this ends tonight.